Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on counting young children in the 2020 census. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy during this difficult time. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. And as a national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. Today, we are excited to dive deeper into the impact of the 2020 census on children and the importance of including young children in your census forms to ensure they are not missed in the census. Next slide, please. As you may know, this webinar is the 21st installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide and the next slide. We have a great agenda in store for today. First, we're going to go over some of our Count Us in 2020 resources, and then we'll turn it over to two speakers from Count All Kids and Voices for Alabama's Children. We'll have Q&A at the end of the webinar, and you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. Check out our census website at countusin2020.org for all of our webinars and accompanying summary blogs. The website also hosts our toolkit, fact sheets, partner resources, and more. We actually just updated all 12 of our Get Out the Count fact sheets in English last week, and you can also request customizable copies of those 12 fact sheets to add your own logo, your own contact information, and local Get Out the Count details. And we also have a COVID-19 page with the latest information on changing Census Bureau operations and updated field guidance. And you can find more information on Census Bureau operations and the latest changes announced, translated, on the different language pages under our main resources. Questions? Advancing Justice AJC and APIA Vote are ready to take your census questions. So call the hotline at 844-2020-API or 844-202-0274 for answers to your questions in English and multiple Asian languages. And this hotline is strictly for answering questions regarding the census, such as how can I fill out the census online? Or what languages is the paper form available in? This hotline is not meant for filling out the census. And if you wish to fill out the census on the phone, please call the Census Bureau's questionnaire assistance phone lines. And you can find sample posts and shareable graphics in the toolkit if you'd like to help us promote this hotline and share it with your networks. And these are some of the graphics that you can find in the toolkit. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Joseph Battistelli, who is the Director of Outreach and Membership at the Coalition on Human Needs and part of the Count All Kids campaign. Joseph?
Hi, just making sure everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. It's always wonderful working with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and this is one of my favorite topics. Like it was just said, my name is Joseph Battistelli, and I am part of the leadership for the Count All Kids campaign, which is a collaborative effort between the Partnership for America's Children, the Coalition on Human Needs, First Focus, and 0 to 3, and many other organizations that are helping out also. Next slide. Just for an overview, we're going to talk about counting children, the why of the counting children, and in the census helps them thrive, which children are missed and why, what's the best strategy for counting all children, and how the COVID-19 pandemic impacts our work. Next. The problem is very simple. In 2010, children 0 to 4 were undercounted by far more than any other subgroup population in the country. not by age, not by race, not by anything else. Children are the ones that are not counted. Next. This, of course, within children gets even worse for sub-breakdowns of racial populations. It's on average 5%, but for Black children or alone in combination, it's over 6%. For Hispanic children, it's over 7%. There is an undercount of Asian children and Middle Eastern and North African, but statistically, we don't actually, weren't able to crunch those numbers. Next. I would also like to state that the problem is growing. Some of you guys already might know this, but since the 1980s, the counts of adults have actually gotten better, but the counting of young children has gotten worse every decade since 1980. They're more likely to be missed in higher population counties, so in large suburbs or urban areas. Mail return rates are not good predictors of where children are missed. And historically, immigration hasn't been a big factor, but it is this time. Just to point out, there's a lot of children 0 to 4 living with at least one undocumented parent. Next. Children are only missed for 2 reasons and 2 reasons only. They live in a household that is not likely to respond because the household is characteristically poor, young, renters, large apartment buildings, and so the entire household didn't respond, or when they are left off the form for when a form is sent back to the Census Bureau or filled out online or responded by phone. I want to, next slide. I want to really emphasize that point. Children are left off forms that are returned to the Census Bureau. So keep that in mind, that's a key thing. Next slide, please. Many, in fact, most children that are missed in this decennial census, I will say, are actually part of that, where they are left off the form. Demographic research has shown us that they're missed in multi-generational or extended families when they don't belong to the same family unit, even though they share the residence, or when they're in a linguistically isolated household. Just for those of you guys who don't know, linguistically isolated households are when a family or dwelling speaks one language, but they're surrounded in a community that does not speak that language at all. And so if it is a family that speaks primarily Chinese in the household, but are surrounded by a English-speaking community, that household's more likely to be missed, and so is their child. Other factors are mostly children of color, belonging to single moms, young parents, especially those without high school degrees. Again, linguistically isolated households. Oh, missed some slides there. There we go. And grandparents are the ones taking care of the young children, and children are not related to the house, the person who householder, to the person who owns or rents the household. Next slide. We've done a lot of focus and opinion research on this. And what's scary is that 10% of people would not count their young child, and another 8 are uncertain if they're going to be counting their young child. And remember, we're already through the census. Some of this information is a little old. And so I'm not going to focus too long on this, but it's important to know that people are convinced they shouldn't be counting temporary residents. Also, as a side note, a lot of this information you either might know or we're not going to cover right now, but it's going to be included in your slides, and so you get these slides after the end of this webinar so you know it and have it and can reference it. Next slide. Counting young children requires a different strategy than counting parents. I know this is going to sound obvious and maybe even a little stupid, but no young child fills out their own census form. There is no 3-year-old that's going online and going to census.gov and doing this. We've got to reach the parents. We've got to reach the caregivers. We've got to reach who is ever actually filling out the census for that household. And they need to hear this message to count young children many times. Next slide. Kids are being missed even where adults are likely to be counted because they're being left off the form, and the hard to count maps are a very good place to start with this. And so I've left that URL so you guys can reference that, but it kind of shows what communities. And while we don't have direct knowledge that children are being missed in those communities, we know that they're at much higher risk of being missed in certain communities, such as high population centers. Next slide. There's a way to counteract this, and that's the messaging. It all comes down to messaging with children and making sure that our kids are counted. And we have 3 examples here. So the first is that counting children means more funding for schools. 82% of people we asked found this convincing. Also, help government plan for future and determines the level of funding for federal government programs, services children use, including schools, childcare, housing, and transportation. Again, 82%. And then the census only happens once every 10 years. So if we don't count a 2-year-old, your community will lose funding for education, childcare, and other services they will need for 10 years, most of their childhood. 81% found that convincing. I want to emphasize that last point. When we miss a child, your community cannot fix that for 10 years. And so when we make sure we want to count all the young kids, it's that if we miss a kid at age 4, they're almost in high school before we can even start to plan to fix the funding discrepancy there. Next slide. There's a lot of reasons why kids aren't missed. And we've talked about some of them already. I've gone over some of them, but it also has to do with fear. And I wanted to go back to the immigration issue here. Immigrants might fear putting their kids on. They might not want to include their kids because they don't want the government knowing. They might have data security concerns, even if they're not immigrants. There's lots of reasons why people don't want to volunteer information about their children. That is legitimate. Do not dismiss those fears. You have to acknowledge those concerns as legitimate, and you address them as best you can. Next slide. So how to respond to some of these concerns are listed here. I've just listed out some quick stuff here that you guys can go back and check out. But if you want more questions answered or you have specific scenarios, please reach out to me. My info is at the end of this webinar. Please reach out to me. I'd be happy to help with everyone with all of this. Next slide, please. I want to be very clear. This slide is incredibly important because it has just a basic, you can actually print this slide out and hand it out if you want. It has what's on the census, what's not on the census, and why responding to the census is safe. It's just a quick thing that anyone can use. We can also get this translated to any language you want. Next slide, please. Here's where we get a little sticky. Obviously, when Asian American Advancing Justice, the Count All Kids campaign, and so many others started this work, including the Census Bureau, we had no idea we'd be facing a pandemic. Before I get into anything else, I want to say that all the work that you guys have been doing, all the stuff that you've been learning so far, both in this webinar and others, still applies. It's still the best information. The census is still happening. It's still important. Your responses are still secure, and it's important that everyone does it, not just for themselves, but for their communities. There have been hurdles we've had to deal with, and God knows our work has changed to deal with these concerns. You can't do in-person events. We've had to rely a lot more on digital, which is harder to target and relies on literacy rates, which even if you might know English fluently, verbally, you can talk on the phone. If you're an immigrant to this country and you grew up learning Korean and reading Korean, you might not be fluent in reading English. And so literacy, because digital ads require that, do fall under that, there's a problem and drawback there. And then of course, when census takers start walking neighborhoods, because of the pandemic, people might not be willing to open the doors. Next slide. I want to talk about how to adapt to this. And we worked very hard on this. I know AAJC has, I know Naleo has worked on this a lot, and a lot of other great partners are doing a lot of this work. And I will say that the main takeaway is this: keep the conversation going by any means necessary. Make sure your community knows that the census is still happening. Make sure that they know that it's still important. That is above and beyond the biggest priority all of us have in front of us. We cannot let the census slip away from the front page. It has to be on people's minds. Getting to a complete and accurate count has to be the priority here, in a safe and effective manner, of course. This means doing media outreach to both local and national media outlets. This means social media. This means getting local newspapers. This means putting up flyers if you can. The other part of keeping this conversation alive is get your community leaders involved. Get faith and civic association leaders involved. Get your kids' soccer coach involved. Get your teachers involved. Ask your teachers and your school principal for your kids, why aren't they sending home a mailer about the census? It means funding for that school. The second is be positive. There are a lot of concerns, and they are serious and they are legitimate, but be positive. The census is happening, filling it out helps people. You should take part. Don't go negative. Don't talk about, you know, what the administration is doing or not doing. Don't talk about the struggles of the census. Be positive. Push forward to a complete and accurate count. And remember, a complete and accurate census would actually help us respond to public health issues. And so you can actually use the current crisis as another example about why the census is so important. And the last part, and this is my favorite part, focus on the kids. Everyone likes to help children, and it helps move this narrative forward. While there's questions about the census and why there's various political narratives, people in this country, by and large, come together to help children, and we're happy to do that. I can't stress this enough. When you talk about the census and its benefits, when you focus on the benefits to kids, you get positive reactions. Next slide. In summary, and I didn't take too long, hopefully, the number of children that are at risk of being missed in the decennial census is large, and it's a growing problem, and the consequences are very serious. Many children are missed even when adults in the household are counted because they're left off the form, and we need strategies to adjust to that. We need to communicate to those parents, those caregivers, those guardians, those unrelated adults that just happen to have kids living in those households. Counting children means more funding for schools, for programs, for services that help children. Service providers and others are a very good way to make sure that they act as trusted messengers. And I'm especially highlighting service providers, because service providers are the ones that people will listen to, whether they're your teacher, whether they're your lawyer, whether they're your pastor and they're providing a service of faith, whether they're your doctor. These are the people in our community that we listen to. And you can get more resources, especially about counting children, at countallkids.org. And I wasn't able to hyperlink, but I will get that link out there. Next slide. That's it. This is my contact information. It's going to be up on the screen for just a moment. But hopefully we can also come back to it later. And please bring your questions. I will be answering as many as I can. I guess back to you, Erica.
Thank you, Joseph.
Oh, Bessie, sorry.
We definitely have to keep the conversation going on. The census is still going on. People can still respond online, by phone, and by the paper form that they received. And census responses are still protected by the strongest confidentiality protections in place. And I definitely second what Joseph said. If a child is missed in the census, it's something that can't be corrected for the next 10 years. And the stakes are so high for our communities because the census determines the distribution of $1.5 trillion each year for 10 years. And that includes funding to schools. So make sure young children in your community are counted and included in their households forms. Next, I will turn it over to our second and final speaker, Stephen Warner, who is the Executive Director of Voices for Alabama's Children. Stephen.
Good afternoon, folks. It is an honor and a privilege to speak with you today. Again, my name is Stephen Warner, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director for Voices for Alabama's Children. As you can see, our mission is to speak for the well-being of Alabama's children through research, public awareness, and advocacy. Voices has existed since 1992, and we were created in response to data. The NEEKC National Kids Count Data Project ranked Alabama 48th out of 50 states for the health, education, safety, and economic security of the children in our state. And almost 30 years ago, a group of organizations came together to examine if there was anyone in the state that was paying attention to that data, and the answer was no. And so out of that group, Voices for Alabama's Children grew as a 501c3 statewide advocacy organization. We are not a direct service organization. We work with child advocates, we work with numerous partners, but we don't have a lot of direct contact with Alabama's children and their families. And so we sit in a very unique place in how we got engaged with the census. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we are a Kids Count grant recipient. And so we produced the Alabama Kids Count grant data book that you see in front of you. And the bedrock of that book is census data. How many children are there? Where do they live? What is their demography? Demographic details? Are they in poverty, et cetera? And those are information that we can only really get from the census. So for the 2000 and the 2010 census, there wasn't a lot of awareness of the undercount of kids, at least in Alabama. I think in 2008, 2009, the governor issued a proclamation about the census 2 weeks before, and that was the sum total of efforts to organize around the census. That is not the case this year. We've been involved in the census effort since 2018, and we started looking at this undercount of young children, realizing our data was bad. In 2010, there were 17,318 children missed in the census. That's about 5.5% of the children under the age of 4 or 4 and under. And so we recognized that we had an opportunity, but also an obligation. If we're going to use the data to tell the story of our children, we need to make sure that that data is correct. It's also about $13 billion a year in federal funding that comes to Alabama. And those services that those funds pay for are the services that our children need the most. And so that's how we sort of got involved in this whole effort. And we started taking almost 2 years ago, actually over 2 years ago, we started looking at our circle of relationships, our allied partners, organizations, who do we work with, who uses our data, and began to line out a campaign that would last almost 2 years about how we were going to organize Alabama around the undercount of young children. Next slide, please. So we started out with those facts. 17,318 kids. And that undercount costs us about $13 million a year, just in the top 5 funds that specifically address kids. Again, I mentioned $13 billion in federal dollars that come to the state based on census. We backed out of that and said, how do those numbers impact our children? And this is just the top 5 federally funded programs that impact children and family. So next slide, please. Next slide. As I mentioned, we started looking at our relationships. Who do we work with? Who do we know? And we started out in early 2019 working with what are called our Children's Policy Councils. The Children's Policy Councils are mandated by the governor. Every single county, 63 of our 67 counties have an active Children's Policy Council. And they are convened by or chaired by the juvenile court judge, but it's the school superintendent, it's the mayor's office, it's the decision makers at the county level. And every year they're supposed to report back to the state legislature what are the biggest issues addressing kids in their community. So these are standing committees that represent the grassroots and grass tops in every county. And so we started going out in January, February of 2019, speaking to those children's policy councils. By the end of last year, we met with 51 of the 63 that exist. and had traveled over 15,000 miles all over the state, reaching out to our partners. Our ask was, or the agenda for that meeting was, this is the importance of the census. It's coming. You better start getting ready. And kids are missed. We were highlighting that undercount of young children to the folks that are supposed to report about the children in their community. As much as anything, it was an educational campaign about the census is coming and your kids are getting missed, and they're getting missed in communities that are hard to count because they're difficult to reach, because they're, as Joe mentioned, linguistically isolated, complex family situations, poverty situations, broadband issues, all of those things that we know contribute to a difficult count are endemic in Alabama. A couple things of note: Alabama is tied for 4th in the country for non-traditional homes, so children not living with their direct parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. So we already have that as a major issue. We have most of our counties, 55 of our counties are considered rural, and many of our counties do not have sufficient access to broadband. So a number of challenges that we were trying to address in advance. So based on those Children's Policy Council meetings, we were asking them to convene community leaders forums. And that is using a round robin or discussion format. We were asking questions instead of coming in with solutions. So we hosted over 25 of our community leaders forums back out in the counties, and they were in large urban counties, Birmingham, our largest city, but also some of our most rural counties, sharing information and asking questions about who are the decision makers, who are the trusted voices, what are the barriers to complete count in your community. And we really tried to give them the right questions so that they could form the right tools for their communities. And then moving from that, last fall, we convened one of the first statewide complete count committees to specifically address the undercount of young children. The governor had convened in late 2018 a statewide complete count committee that was the business community, the faith community, the healthcare community. There wasn't any entity looking at the undercount of young children, so Voices for Alabama's Children convened that group. And we had a total of 5 meetings over the course of the next 6 months. 4 of them were in person, and then our last one was virtual in April. Obviously, because of the pandemic, we weren't going to get folks together. We brought about 50 different partner organizations, and we highlighted statewide organizations to that table. It included the Lieutenant Governor's Office, our Department of Education, our Department of Human Resources, our Department of Early Childhood Education, Mental Health, pretty much all of the state agencies that touch kids. We had the Department of Corrections commissioner there. It was a very diverse group of state agencies. But then we also had the American Academy of Pediatrics. We had our Foster Care Association. We had a truly diverse group of organizations all convening around this data that Joseph shared with you, the message testing that Count All Kids had done, and then aligning all of our efforts about how we were going to collectively across all of our networks use the same messaging to reach out to families. We did the math, and it was over 3 million families that we touched, just looking at aggregating all of the networks within that group of 50 agencies. We kept pushing resources to them, and because we're not a direct service organization, we primarily served as this disseminator of information, but also the advocating on behalf of the census. Prior to 2019, the state of Alabama had not allocated any real resources to census organization. Voices is a lobbying entity, and we went to the state legislature asking for $5 million for grassroots organizations. We got $1 million, and we were really, really thrilled with that. And then the governor then appropriated another $2.5 million. All of that for messaging and communications and organization. And those dollars went to grassroots organizations and statewide organizations, from the community college system to county commissions, to help pay for organizing efforts. Building on all of that, we kept disseminating information and pushing out resources to all of these agencies. And then we had always planned that once the census started, we were going to pivot and move towards a very targeted social media campaign. We were probably one of the only entities in the state that wasn't significantly impacted by COVID-19, because we had never planned on knocking on doors. That isn't our role. That isn't what we do. We are primarily an advocacy organization and a communications shop. So starting in March, we started pushing out these details. This is a county profile. We produced one of those for all 67 counties. We're sharing that information. Next slide, if you would. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. As I mentioned, we met with 51 of the 63 CPCs. We held 25 community leaders forums. We went to 97 different events with a combined audience of in person over almost 15,000. We also did, as I mentioned, a really targeted social media campaign. Joseph mentioned the hard to count map, and we were digging down to zip codes and to census tracts, looking at where those hardest to count populations were, and doing a very, very targeted social media campaign. Though it was a sponsored campaign, we used grant dollars to begin to push out messages to specific demographics, particularly grandparents with children in the home, young parents, within the zip codes where we know the most children were missed. The 200 posts reached 111,000. Our Twitter work went out. One of the things we're really excited about is as we pushed out that social media campaign, we began to see a pretty good response rate. We had several million impressions, but collectively we're at almost 18,000 clicks on our ads to go take the census. Considering there are only 17,000 children missed in 2010, we were really, really pleased with that, to know that our work was paying off. Again, we didn't stop disseminating information. Next slide, please. We talked about the convening the Birth to 5 Complete Count Committee, and we also served at the statewide Complete Count committees on 5 of the 9 subcommittees. We've hosted conferences. We've also, that 1.87 million Alabamians, 7 million impressions. That 6,300 is our first half of the campaign. We've got another 11,000 clicks in June, July, and August through to take the census. We continue to partner with a bunch of the state agencies as well, and it's been really fascinating to see how much Alabama has embraced the census as a non-political issue. For relevance, Alabama stands to lose 1 and potentially 2 congressional seats, so there's a lot of apolitical interest in making sure we maintain our voice. Not to fault any of y'all in California, but when you start talking about California is going to steal our congressional seat, Alabamans tend to get energized by that. Next slide, please. A lot of those partnerships we developed with our Complete Count Committee were really targeted at, as Joseph mentioned, the direct contacts with families. The poster you see on the left, whose child is missing, was something that we generated using Count All Kids data. And then we put over 25,000 of those posters out. We put them in every single pediatrician's office. We put them in every single one of our pre-K classrooms in the state. We shared them with every single school system. And the thing I'm really excited about that poster is the data is good, but we also had that poster translated into Spanish, Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Korean. And so we were able to put those in the communities in languages that were relevant. And through our partnership with Count All Kids, we were able to get really, really good translations so that it was accessible to the communities, even in this linguistically isolated communities. Those posters and palm cards that went out to home visitors, they went out to pre-K classrooms. We've been able to push that information out across every network we can tap so that folks aren't trying to have to learn all of the nuances of census or make sure that their messaging is correct. One of the things we discovered very quickly is that the amount of misinformation about how the census works, who does it, what it means is rampant. Most folks just know they fill it out, and most folks don't remember when they took it last. And so getting good, accurate information out is really important. And then supplying accurate information to our partners so that they have good resources to share has been a real key part of our role. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, making sure I've got all of the questions answered. What I would encourage you to do at this point in any of your organization is use the relationships you've got. Even if you don't have extensive reach, you work with people every day that do, and share information. There's no shortage of resources available to everyone through the Asian Americans Advancing Justice or Count All Kids. Pretty much any language you can think of, there's probably very, very high quality vetted resources available to you. Don't invent anything. Go out and tap any of us to get those resources that we're delighted to share with it. All of us collectively fundamentally believe that a better count benefits Alabama, it benefits America, benefits all of our communities. And with that, I will wrap up. I think I managed to stay on time. I appreciate you all and the opportunity to share a little bit.
Stephen, thank you for sharing your work in Alabama with us. We have huge Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities in the state, with more than 89,000 Asian Americans and nearly 9,000 Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in the state, in Jefferson, Madison, and Mobile County, and Madison, Jefferson, and DeKalb County. And there are certainly so many challenges with reaching non-traditional homes, rural communities, and households that don't have broadband access. And it's so important to find creative ways to engage our communities around what the census is, why we need to get counted, and how to get counted and get assistance with getting counted. So it's really incredible to see the really diverse coalitions you've pulled together with education, health, foster care, and other agencies that can actually reach households. And I agree, folks, don't invent anything. You can check out all of our resources. We'll send out all of the website links that were mentioned today. And we hope that you'll be able to use these resources, that you can customize them, and just pull information and really just take the information and share it through your platforms and with your networks. This brings us to the end of our speaker presentation, so we will now turn it over to Q&A. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Rima, who will be facilitating our Q&A. And as a reminder, this webinar is recorded, so you'll get a copy of the presentation and the recording after the webinar.
Thanks, and thank you so much to our speakers for sharing your wealth of knowledge today. So if folks have questions, as Bessie mentioned before, you can either raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can type it into the questions or chat box and our speakers can answer them. All right, it seems like we don't have any questions at the moment, but oh, actually it looks like someone just asked a question. All right, so this is from No Orozco. Their question is, are there any back to school campaigns that anyone is aware of regarding the census? And this is for either Stephen or Joe.
So
Yeah.
here in Alabama, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
No, go for it. Go for it.
So here in Alabama, we've been using a lot of different resources. Our Department of Education has a plan and has been pushing out information. We've been doing a lot of feeding campaigns, not only feeding campaigns, but the school lunches have been distributed once a week or twice a week. And so in a lot of our communities, particularly our larger communities, census handouts have been included with the meals that are going home, knowing that most of our counties are community exempt, so every kid in the county is free and reduced price lunch. And so that's been an effort in some of our urban areas. And then some of our rural areas, we've partnered with Teach for America. We have a number of Teach for America teachers who are not teaching because we are virtual at this point. And so a lot of our, those teachers are doing community organizing with the classrooms that they teach and the schools that they teach. So there are a lot of different campaigns. They are diverse, they are dependent on the communities, but there are a lot of resources both from the Census Bureau and some of the partner organizations of really good tools to hand out. The Census Bureau's resources are actually pretty good if they're utilized. And that's been the challenge, is getting superintendents to recognize how important. One of the other fun things we've done, and this is a statewide effort, is we're doing a bracket statewide for the bottom 32 counties. They're competing against each other to see who can raise their census participation rate. And the governor's put a pretty decent chunk of money. I think the winning county that improves their census participation rate the most between now and the end of September gets a $50,000 check from the governor's office to the school system. And so the superintendents are really getting engaged at that point. And it's using a little bit of the state dollars to build on competition.
I'm always in awe of what they're doing in Alabama. It's always just so wonderful. I will also say that at the national level, we are coordinating with both the teachers unions, the superintendents association, and as many school districts as we can get in touch with to make sure that the beginning of the school year incorporates messaging about the census. We are also doing a national art competition with a theme of back to school, where if you or your kid submits artwork, in fact, it's not you, it's just your kid, you you have to let them do some of the art. Submits artwork based off the themes of Census and back to school. You might be eligible to win up to $100 gift card, and there's different age ranges. So please, I will get the links over to AAGC and hopefully they'll pass them along.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? All right, it looks like that is all the questions we have at this time. So thank you again so much to our speakers for presenting today. And thank you, Bessie, for facilitating. And as Bessie mentioned earlier, we'll be sending around the slides, the recording, and all the resources that our speakers mentioned today in our follow-up email. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.